hear now from John Prados.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. We are here this morning to discuss a very serious issue, which John actually has given us a good introduction to, the system of, and I'm going to talk a bit about the reality of. Now, I have been involved in these issues probably close to 4 decades now, since the time that I was a graduate student and discovered while writing my PhD dissertation that all the material that I needed was secret and remained secret. And at the time, there existed, still exists today, something called the Freedom of Information Act, which is actually the underlying legislation that moderates the operation of the classification system that John Powers was discussing a few moments ago. Under that law, it's possible for any citizen like ourselves to ask the government to declassify information, and you can do so. In 1978, I asked for a Central Intelligence Agency document, a national intelligence estimate, so-called, the kind of material that the government assembles to assess the military capability of another military power, in this case, the Soviet Union. And 3 months later, I received back an almost complete set of that national intelligence estimate with very little material blocked out. And it was of great value to me in my scholarly work. As I said, I've been involved in these issues ever since. Today, I am a senior fellow and a project director at the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., where we say we believe in keeping the government honest, one document at a time. But we are, in fact, intimately involved in the whole series of changes in the declassification system that Mr. Powers was discussing. Well, the 3 months that it took me to get a national security estimate declassified in 1978 turned to 19 years in the case of the Central Intelligence Agency and the documentary series that was called the Family Jewels, or 17 years in the case of another CIA set of documents that were intelligence histories of the Vietnam War, or 14 years in the case of an Air Force history about bombing Vietnam during the Indochina War. And that's the reality of the intelligence system. Of the declassification system. The reality is that the nice statutes that are so clearly laid out and the executive orders and the schemes and frameworks of regulation and authorization that are supposed to regulate this system are actually moderated by a set of officials, very much like us sitting here in this room, who are concerned about their own personal interests and their own agency's standing, if you like, before the public. And those kinds of issues play as much of a role in the actual move to declassify information as anything else. We're commemorating here today the Foreign Relations of the United States series, a wonderful achievement. You know, when I was working on that book that I discussed earlier, and I got that National Intelligence Agency, National Intelligence Estimate declassified, those foreign relations volumes were major source material. And I was reading in the 1970s volumes that were 20 years after the date of the material that they were covering. And this really didn't come out so much in Nathan's remarks, that period has been lengthening even as we sit here. And not just because in the 1990s, historians demanded that, in fact, the foreign relations series include a wider range of documentation. The material was already becoming later and later. In the 1970s, the interval between the end of events that were being covered by the series and the appearance of a foreign relations volume that covered that period of time was already moving to the 30-year range. That has continued to widen, that gap between when events take place and when they are actually covered in these documentary conditions. In 1991, this is to say now, almost 2 decades ago, an actual law was passed, thus there is a statute on this subject that the Foreign Relations series is not supposed to be delayed for more than 30 years. I have to tell you today that no volume in the Foreign Relations of the United States series that is currently in production or in declassification review is less old than 30 years. Most volumes in the Foreign Relations series that are in production cover events that happened more than 35 years ago. Almost 1/4 of the volumes that cover the Nixon-Ford administrations, and that's the period where Foreign Relations right now is focusing its work, are mired in declassification review. Although there are volumes of Foreign Relations that date from the 1950s that have yet to be declassified, as well as one from the 1960s. 13 of the 17 volumes that are mired in this declassification review concern those Nixon-Ford era events. So here we get to the rub, the nexus of the problem, the whole question of secrecy versus freedom. And it's of particular moment today, January 9th, that we are meeting to discuss this subject because today happens to be the birthday of Richard Milhous Nixon. Were he alive today, Mr. Nixon could claim credit for 3 of the most important things that happened that influence the entire thing that we're discussing today, this issue of secrecy. Number 1, it was, in fact, Mr. Nixon who put real teeth in the Freedom of Information Act, which had existed since 1966, but which was essentially a moribund statute that had no real power to force a federal government agency to release a document. It's interesting why Mr. Nixon did what he did. In typical Nixonian fashion, it was for a political purpose, and that was that in 1970-71, he went to the Central Intelligence Agency to demand that they release information to him about Kennedy administration policy toward Cuba, which he could then use to score Democrats going into the 1972 election. And the CIA refused to declassify information to the President of the United States, whereupon Mr. Nixon issued an executive order that took away, actually, some of the power of the agency under the 1949 Central Intelligence Act to protect its information. And that was where the Freedom of Information Act first got its teeth. Second thing Mr. Nixon did, also, by the way, involving the Central Intelligence Agency, goes to the question of information versus document. In the case of a former CIA official by the name of Victor Marchetti, Mr. Nixon supported the Central Intelligence Agency's efforts to prosecute Marchetti in federal courts in order to force the person, the target of this lawsuit, to remove material from a published book, a judgment which the federal government was able to obtain in court. The material was removed from the Marchetti book, but the consequence of that was to put a different kind of teeth in the government's hands. And this was the teeth into a publications review panel at the Central Intelligence Agency, which has ever since moderated what can and cannot be said by federal employees. But what it did at the most basic level was to establish that the federal government controlled information, even though in fact and by law, the federal government is not permitted to own copyright in any kind of material. So for the first time, the federal government was asserting a right to own actual information. And the third thing that Mr. Nixon did was, in fact, the Pentagon Papers case to prosecute the New York Times, Washington Post, and a series of other media outlets in an effort to impose prior restraint on the attempt by Americans to bring information to the American public.